Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator at McNally Robinson Booksellers. You'll notice that there are live captions being generated for this evening. So if you do need to access them, please just access the CC live transcript button at the bottom. Naturally, as with any event like this, the transcript will not be exact. And so tomorrow we'll be cleaning up the transcript for the YouTube video, so you'll be able to see it and listen to it better then, or see it better then. I'm just going to begin very quickly. McNally Robinson Booksellers is located on Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. David Demchuk and your host, Kai Cheng Thom, are coming to you live from the traditional lands of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, and the Huron-Wendat. We wish to acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of this land, traditional territory named Takaranto, where the trees meet the water, the gathering place. We do not support colonial forces that undermine, distort, or erase the vital role of Indigenous people in our world. We would also like to pay our respects to the elders, past and present, as well as the ancestors of us all who have gathered here today. We encourage you all to take action in your communities by donating to the Indigenous Community Support Services and cultural organizations, and delivering on the 94 calls to action listed in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission final report. I do apologize for the deeply obnoxious human being who appeared for just a moment ago in the chat. Please rest assured that they have been ejected, and I do apologize to all of you for that. I'm just going to review some of the details of the evening. So the procedure is that I'll be introducing your host for tonight, and then we'll be moving along to a conversation between the two of them. Following the conversation, there'll be an opportunity for you folks to ask questions. You can ask those questions just by accessing the Q&A button that's just at the bottom of the screen there. And if we keep all the questions there, then your host will be able to find them very easily. Please do feel free to chat amongst yourselves in the chat. At the end of the event, I will copy down the chat and I'll send along a copy to both David and Kai Cheng so that they can see all the lovely things that you folks have had to say this evening. And of course, we are here to sell some copies of this book as well. David has very kindly signed McNally Robinson's copies of the book. So we do have signed copies of Red X available. You can order those in a variety of ways, and I'll place that information in the chat in just a moment as well. You can order them online, you can give us a call, you can visit us in person, and we also ship nationally and internationally via Canada Post. In addition to that, if you live in Winnipeg, we can even courier a copy right to your door. So please do take advantage of that. I'm just going to quickly pop that information in the chat right now before I introduce your host for this evening. Host Kai Cheng Thom is a writer, performer, and queer healer based in Toronto, Takaranto. She is the author of 5 award-winning books, including the Stonewall Honor Award-winning essay collection, I Hope We Choose Love, A Trans Girl's Notes from the End of the World, and the Lambda Award-nominated novel, Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars. Kai Cheng's work has been featured by Emma Watson's Feminist Book Club, a podcast hosted by Julie Andrews, and on CTV's The Social. Please join me in welcoming Kai Cheng Thom.
Thank you so much, John, and hello to everyone. Good evening. I am so honored, delighted, excited, and a little terrified to be hosting the launch of David Demchuk's Red X. This is an advanced reader copy, which makes me feel special. So David Demchuk, I would hope needs no introduction, but just in case anybody doesn't know, I need to tell you that he has been writing for print, stage, and other media for more than 40 years. His debut novel, The Bone Mother, published in 2017, was nominated for the Scotiabank Giller Prize the Amazon Canada First Novel Award, the Toronto Book Award, the Kobzar Book Award, and a Shirley Jackson Award in the Best Novel category. It won the 2018 Sunburst Award in the Adult Fiction category. And more important than any of those awards or nominations, it is also a personal favorite of mine. It is the novel that made me fall in love with the horror genre at the age of 27. It it's just an incredible, thrilling, deeply, deeply beautiful work. Almost as beautiful, dare I say, as his second novel, which we are celebrating the launch of tonight, a queer horror slash novel slash memoir, Red X. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to David Demchuk. I wish that you could hear the thunderous applause, David. It's really it seems a little anticlimactic just to have silence.
I hear thunderous applause everywhere I go. So
as well you should.
So yes, well, thank you very much for that incredibly generous introduction. Thank you both, actually. It's wonderful to be here, and it's wonderful to be celebrating this book. I'll tell you just a couple of things about it, and then I'm going to read a tiny bit from it, and then we can get to the discussion. So Red X, I started as a play in 2014. I was actually writing it as a play for Buddies in Bad Times. And at that point, 3 men had disappeared from the village, and there wasn't a great deal of press coverage around it. There wasn't even necessarily a connection among the 3 men. And to me, it was part of what I had seen as a symptom of a larger problem, where I had seen queer men disappearing from cities across Canada, through the United States, other cities around the world. And I wanted to take that on as a subject, and I wanted to place it squarely within Toronto's gay village. And then events unfolded. So the book, the fictional parts of the book are fictional. The autobiographical parts of the book are autobiographical. And I know that we'll get into a discussion of that fairly shortly. I'm going to take a moment to read about 7 minutes worth, I would say, of Red X from the first section, which is set in 1984. For those of you who would have difficulty following the captions, I'm going to paste the link to the Google Doc that I'm going to be reading from. That might be easier for you to follow along on. Otherwise, feel free to look at me as I stagger my way through this, since I haven't read from it very often. There you go. That's now in the chat. And I'm about to start. The excerpt I'll call, Who is Nicholas? Who is Nicholas? Asked Trevor, Ryan's roommate. 8 days had passed since anyone had seen Ryan, and Trevor and Victor were in his room searching for his family's phone number in Windsor, looking through his coat and pants pocket, his desk, the boxes in his closet, and the various scraps of paper piled on the nightstand, the seat of the armchair, and around the portable TV perched on the dresser. Trevor was holding a yellow sticky note he had found next to the bed. Nicholas was scrawled on it, jumbled but legible, as if he'd written it down in a hurry or right after waking up. Not a clue, Victor answered. He never talked about guys. I thought maybe he'd taken the vow. With AIDS infections on the rise in the city and conflicting information circulating about how it was transmitted, what the incubation period was, and even what all the symptoms were, some guys were limiting themselves to group massage or jack-off clubs, while others were abandoning sex entirely. A third group, maybe the largest, was having as much sex as before and possibly more, with varying levels of anonymity, precaution, defiance, and fatalism, followed by hours and days and weeks of anxiety about whether the virus was now spreading from cell to cell inside them. That's all there is, just the name. Trevor stuck it onto the corner of the desk. He was already imagining how much work it would be to clean out the room and find someone new. Maybe he should just go it alone for a few months. He never mentioned it to me, Victor replied, and yet the name did ring a bell from somewhere, if not from Ryan, a customer at the bar or a guest at the hotel. There was that moment at work by the washroom the last night he saw Ryan when he seemed so frightened, but Victor hadn't seen anyone. What are all these? Trevor moved the nightstand aside, revealing a pile of sketchbooks by the bed. He picked one up, flipped through it, drawings in pencil and charcoal, most of them men, most of them nudes. One man came up again and again, black hair, black brows, piercing eyes, hairy chest, nice uncut cock. Cute. He drew his own porn. He turned the book around to so Victor could see. Ring any bells? Lots of them, but no, I've never seen him before. Trevor turned the sketch back around and looked it over carefully. Me neither. If I was going to run off with anyone, though, I'd want it to be with him. While Trevor looked through the sketchbooks, Victor sifted through a sheaf of snapshots and postcards he'd found in Ryan's bedside table. It was strange, poring over the personal items of someone who was both familiar and a stranger, looking for clues to a mystery that might not be a mystery. And it was strange being here with Trevor. When Ryan hadn't shown for work on Saturday night, Victor had called twice, left 2 messages, but got no response. He did the same the following afternoon when Boots hosted its weekly tea dance. He was dismayed, but assumed that Ryan had quit without quitting, a not uncommon phenomenon in the service industry. So he was surprised when the following Tuesday, he had answered the phone at the bar to find Ryan's roommate, Trevor Mullen, on the other end. He'd been away working all weekend and had come back to Victor's messages. Ryan was nowhere to be found. It seemed too soon to call the police over what might turn out to be nothing. Trevor suggested they wait till a full week had passed. He had a funeral to go to the following Saturday, but said Victor should come by for lunch so they could figure out next steps. As Victor was getting dressed to head over to Trevor's, though, the police called to say that Ryan's clothes and wallet and ID had been found, and that was never a good sign. When Trevor opened the door, he realized that he and Victor had gotten together once a few years earlier, well before Ryan had come to the city. Victor had figured it out about 4 minutes earlier as he was looking at the buzzer board. It was one of those coincidences typical of the gay community, like finding out that you share a dentist or that you used to live on the same street. They had eyed each other one Wednesday evening at a rally protesting the Baz raids. Trevor tall and blonde and boyishly handsome, Victor shorter and broader with a stocky, muscular build, and then had seen each other again later on at Stages, the dance club above the Parkside Tavern. They made their way to each other and then to the door, and then went back to Victor's place for some vigorous sex that prompted a next-door neighbor to pound on the wall and left them both giggling like schoolboys. They shushed each other, and Trevor rode Victor's cock slower and deeper, Victor jerking him until they both came in a rush of murmurs, gasps, and sighs just seconds apart. After, as they lay together, Victor became a bit teary and confided that a friend of his had just died in New York from some kind of 1 in a million skin cancer. He went to the gym, he didn't smoke, he didn't use drugs, he was a fucking vegetarian. If someone like that could up and die at the age of 30, what did it mean for the rest of us? Trevor didn't know what to say. He just held Victor closer. But he too had heard of men getting suddenly ill in New York and San Francisco and cities overseas. And then a few weeks later, there it was in the New York Times, rare cancer seen in 41 homosexuals, though Trevor knew through the flight attendant grapevine that the number was considerably higher and encompassed more than just gay men. I thought I heard him come home last night, Trevor sighed, sifting through a pile of check stubs and matchbooks and cab receipts and credit card bills. I heard footsteps in the hallway. I actually lifted my head off the pillow and I thought I heard him come into my room all the way to the end of the bed. Okay, that's not creepy at all, Victor said, thumbing through a handful of old porn zines from New York that somehow made it across the border. Right? I sat up. I called his name. I came in here to look and, of course, found nothing. Everything was the way he left it. Trevor sighed. I guess this is what it's going to be like now, all these new silences, and you fill them with whatever you expect to hear. He pulled down a postcard pinned to the wall, held it under the light. It was a promotion for a screening of Kenneth Anger's Magic Lantern Cycle at an art gallery on Queen Street, a fundraiser for one of the bathhouses damaged in the raids. The cycle had screened over 3 nights at the beginning of August. Had Ryan actually gone? He didn't seem like the type to sit through an evening of experimental film, no matter how many dicks were on display. But maybe he was. The art books and sketchbooks and posters and postcards suggested a side of Ryan that Trevor hadn't seen before, or maybe just hadn't noticed. I had a bad dream, Victor said abruptly, bashfully, as if he had done something wrong by having it, or maybe now by mentioning it. I don't remember much of it, but Ryan was in it, at least at the end, and he was in the bed with me, and he was so cold. His hands were like ice, and he pulled me up onto my side so that I faced him. He said something like, if he reaches for you, then he's already caught you. Something like that. He sang it almost like a children's rhyme. Jesus, and you think my shit is creepy. Trevor pinned the anger postcard back on the wall next to an Odorama card for the John Waters movie Polyester. Who's supposed to be reaching for you, Ronald Reagan? Victor shrugged. I don't know. It didn't make any sense. I mean, I don't even know why we were in bed together. I liked him and all, but I was never actually into him. What do you think it means? Nothing. It doesn't mean anything, Trevor replied. It's just garbage that your brain is trying to get rid of to make room for new garbage. We're all having bad dreams. We all have a lot going on. Funny thing though, Trevor added, I woke up and I was covered in cum. It shot up out of my boxers and under my t-shirt. Definitely not Reagan then. Trevor was examining a plain white postcard with a hole punched in it, signed by Yoko Ono, a hole to see the sky through. It was my first wet dream in years, Victor continued. I didn't even know what it was. In the dark, I thought it was blood. I threw myself out of bed and ran to the washroom. I was so scared. Blood and semen, the precious bodily fluids. Maybe Ryan had been diagnosed. Maybe he had run off. Nicholas could be an AIDS counselor, or maybe the name of a doctor. Trevor knew that there were bars and restaurants that would flat out fire you, and others that wouldn't allow you in food prep areas or let you handle glassware or garnishes or ice for the comfort and safety of the customers. The service industry didn't have drug plans or medical plans. You were at the mercy of the healthcare system itself. So maybe Ryan had panicked and ran. But if so, where? And for what? Oh, look. Trevor reached for an old Penguin paperback, worn with creases in the spine. It was a high school copy of The Hound of the Baskervilles. He took it from the shelf, opened it up. Ryan's name, Windsor address, and phone number were on the inside front cover, carefully printed in blue ballpoint. Bingo, he said, and handed it to Trevor. Let's give that a try. Do you really think he'd be back at his mother's? Victor asked. No, Trevor answered, but the police might have called her, maybe told her something they're not telling us. It's not that big a city. People don't just disappear. And if they do, they don't leave their clothes and shit behind. And yet they did. Men had gone missing from the bars and clubs and baths, one or two every few years for as far back as he could remember. There had been talk on and off of serial killers, gangs of thugs, cops who wanted to teach the fags a lesson. He couldn't help but wonder if Ryan had walked down the wrong alley, asked the wrong guy for the time, and now was face down in the water somewhere along the shore or tossed into a dumpster. Victor stepped up behind him, put his arms around him, rested his head against Trevor's neck. Hey, he said, it's okay. It was comforting and oddly arousing too. Trevor could feel the bulge in Victor's jeans pressing against him. Something inside him stirred, surprising him. He almost never played with the same guy twice. But as he relaxed into Victor's embrace, he glanced over at Ryan's bed and felt a rush of revulsion. He had a sudden urge to look beneath it, certain that something was under there, listening and watching. Not here, he whispered. I ain't afraid of no ghosts, Victor whispered back with an audible grin. Yeah, Trevor answered, but I am. He turned and, taking Victor's hands in his own, led him out into the hallway, towards his own room and onto his bed. As they began to undress, to kiss and touch each other, he was sure he heard Ryan's bedroom door click shut. There you go.
Okay. I was going to summon another round of applause, but I see it is already pouring into the chat. Let's keep it going, folks. I want all the clapping emojis.
Oh, well, thank you.
David.
I promise after I've done this like 10 more times, it will flow a little better. But yes, that I picked, it was hard to choose something that wasn't going to absolutely drive people off the channel. So I thought, okay, this isn't too bad. It just has some, some foreplay and soon to be some fucking in it. It won't be too bad.
I could listen to you read erotic horror gore all night long, David.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I will keep that in mind.
And I just want to point out for our readers that you have some incredibly horror-esque lighting going on. Um, Beautiful sort of a red haze just coming down over you. It's really quite astonishing and apropos for tonight. I see, yes, very Suspiria, this lighting is a comment that's
Thank you.
come through in the chat. So there you are. Excellent in all ways. um, well, first and foremost, congratulations on your second book, David.
Thank you.
It's so amazing. It's really, truly
It's so
haunting.
amazing that it's done. It's so amazing that it's done.
Well, I mean, I was going to ask you, and maybe I'll just jump ahead into questions if that's okay. I
Feel
mean,
free.
how was it to write this book? Because of course it is, incredible, suspenseful, it's entertaining, it's titillating, dare I say. There's a lot of, I mean, maybe I'm revealing too much about myself, but I found it very sexy as well as quite horrifying. And I mean, there's the link between sex and horror is something that I intend to question you about later on.
Feel free.
But what was it like to write this book? Because also, as it escapes no one in the audience, I'm sure, it is extremely personal as well and touches on some really resonant undercurrents, political, personal, for queer people everywhere. I would say probably gay men in particular, and in Toronto's village. How was it to take on this piece of work, which has taken, I would imagine, several years?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I started it as a play in 2014, so it's been quite a long time. Once I finished, I wrote the draft for the play, which was weirdly, it did have Nicholas. It had mention of the victims, and then of course when people appeared on stage, there were some ghostly things that were experienced by actors on the stage as well as in the audience. There was a sort of a meta thing going on. It became a kind of a Phantom of the Opera, but in Buddies in Bad Times. It was interesting. And I had a meeting with Brendan Healy about it, which was a very good meeting, but he was very frank, and he said, in Canadian theater, unless you're doing like Fringe or something extremely commercial, there's not really an audience for horror, and not really a path towards horror in the sense that I was writing it. And I was like, that's just fine. It was really the only theater that it could possibly be taken to. So after having worked on it for a year, which for me was not that long a time, I just put it in a drawer, and then I worked on the next thing, which turned out to be the Thimble Factory, which transformed into the Bone Mother. And then I had like a hit, right? And it was like, oh my God, I've never had that. So at that point, I thought, this turning plays into books thing could be viable.
maybe you're onto something.
Yeah, maybe I should go back to Red X and see what I can do with it. So I did take it out. And by that time, more stuff had happened. We're talking around, say, 2016, 2017. And I became more aware that I was not only writing about something that was happening sort of on a larger level, but I was also writing about something that was happening to people around me in a place where I lived and functioned, within a community. And it was like, I can fictionalize this. I can turn this into a kind of a monster story and use it, in the back way to address a whole lot of issues. So I'll give that a try. And I actually got quite far with it like that and going quite well. And I had the notion that I had also wanted to do something that would comment on my relationship with the material as a queer person, my love of horror, my own physical issues, things like that. And I was well into that and just working away on it. And then a friend of mine disappeared, my friend Andrew Kinsman. And then, and of course, there was a great search. There was great fear from everyone. It really landed a lot of stuff for me. And then, of course, his body was found. And I actually stopped the project dead. And I turned to a friend of mine, Ing Wong Ward, who was a very close friend, a journalist at the CBC, tremendous support through the whole writing process. And I said to her, I can't keep writing this. This is, there's no way that I can take what's going on around us now and merrily just create this fictional version. And she was like, no, you don't understand. You have to write it now. It's crucial that you write it now. And I was like, okay. And then I just went away, regrouped for a while, and I came back to her. She was tremendously helpful and said to her, if I'm going to do this and I'm going to do this way, I have to insert myself more directly into the work. I have to really grapple with what doing this kind of work means for me, not necessarily from a trauma perspective as much as a processing perspective. And I just have to face it head on, because anybody who reads this book is going to know what's going on in the real world. And she coached me along what I would say was a way that I could write it while still protecting myself. And that was extremely helpful for me. I was not as self-protective when I wrote The Bone Mother, and there were things about writing parts of The Bone Mother that I found actually quite traumatic. And so self-care was very much part of this process. And also, it has to be said, I'll be 60 next year. So things that it would be dangerous for me to do at 25, talking about things with my family, talking about things about disability and things like that, are much less so for me. The stakes have changed dramatically for me as I'm entering one of my final decades. So I thought to myself, if ever you're going to put yourself out there, if ever you're going to say what you want to say, if ever you're going to express your anger and hatred towards Toronto and a variety of other things that go on here, now's the time. Now's the time. When else are you going to do it? So, and that was more or less the path I took. And I will say, I mean, my agent and I, we had many discussions. We were never sure that anyone was ever going to pick the book up. But I actually described it in one line. This is going to be one of those rare moments. I described it in one line on Twitter, and Jordan Ginsburg entered my DMs and said, I don't know where you're at with this book. I don't know how finished you are. But I want to see it. And I was like, you will see it. And lo and behold, he is the person who published it. So, and was just a tremendous support throughout the entire process. And all the things that I had, that I was hesitant about, he went for without hesitation. So that was fantastic.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing so generously from your process around the book. There are so many things you said that there's my next question. Oh, there's a next one. Okay. Because I want to talk to you about this book.
Sure.
All night long. But let's see. I mean, I think what I will say is, I'm so grateful that you wrote this book, actually. I'm grateful that you write it all, of course, but this particular book, when you talk about, well, now I have to write this book, right? In the wake of everything that has happened. Oh, look, there's Jordy Ginsburg in the chat right now with some hearts for you, David. And you say it's not from a trauma perspective, but one thing that I will say I really learned from reading The Bone Mother before you and I ever spoke, or even online, is that book taught me that horror is in fact about trauma and about grief in many ways. And then here you come with your second book, Red X, and I mean, I will be honest and say, when I first got the advanced reader copy you so generously dropped off at my apartment in the middle of the village, I hesitated to read it. I was like, oh my God, this book is going to be amazing. And also, I am terrified to read this book. I don't know if I'm ready to read it. I'd lived in the village. I just escaped from it, a week or so ago. You're still there, I know. But and then I did read it, and I read it all in one shot, start to finish, and cried after reading it. And then I read it the second time in preparation for this for this interview and cried again at the end. And I feel such great relief in knowing you've put out this book in some ways, because it does help me process what it meant to be in that village for that relatively like quite short amount of time. I was there like 5 years, and I imagine that for many readers, they will feel something of that too. There is something actually kind of healing about reading this horror novel because it is so deeply engaged. And I mean, this is my plug for your book for folks who haven't read it yet. I mean, I assume they intend to because they are here, but this is more than a work of horror fiction, right? It's also a work of meta commentary. It is autofiction. Your life is woven into it. There's so much that resonates with the real and the fantastical, with the political and the personal. And so, I mean, it's also a history in many ways of Toronto's gay village. And so I don't know, I'm bowled over by it. And I guess that what I want to ask next is, you know, because so much of it is woven into the real and into what is happening and what has happened in Toronto's village, like how much is fiction and how much is fact?
Okay. As you can appreciate, it's complicated, but I will try to make it sort of as simple as I can. Until I'm not going to give away too many spoilers until the final section, which we just kind of won't talk about.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah, well, we can, but we'll talk about it in vague, enticing terms. The book is fairly cleanly divided into fiction sections and essays that are written by me about my life, about my experiences, about my perceptions. And it's very easy to tell what those are. In the fiction sections, there is still some nonfiction. In the fiction sections, there are landmarks. The landmarks are real. There are geographical descriptions of things going on throughout and under Toronto, and those are real too. The characters' addresses are fictional. Some of those buildings don't even exist. But they do, as the fictional characters do wander around, and they do see very familiar buildings, very familiar landmarks, very familiar things that you and I would see every day. And that it was intentional that we give that sort of immersive feeling of what it's like living in Toronto in each of these eras that I look at. So that stuff is fairly easy to suss out. Alexander Wood.
I was going to ask, can we talk about Alexander Wood?
Yeah, Alexander Wood, problematic Alexander Wood. He plays a small but significant role as a character in the book, because there is a section that occurs really at the start of Toronto's history, when Toronto was the town of York, and Alexander Wood had arrived from Scotland, and wanted to make a life for himself here. And so we know the story of him becoming a magistrate, of there being a rape case where he was required to, which he was required to investigate, and he had to examine the genitals of a number of young men because apparently the victim had scratched one of the men on his genitals. And there was a concern that remains unresolved that perhaps he was framed, that perhaps this was a setup in order to expose him as a sodomite. We don't know for sure what the deal is there, but the reality is he did in fact examine these men. He did in fact examine their genitals. And as a result, he felt that he was compromised. And he explained to a friend of his, who was ultimately going to be adjudicating his case, that he knew that he had committed this misdeed and that he would be suffering for it. The friend of his, rather than jailing him, rather than punishing him in any way, encouraged strongly that he go into exile back in Scotland, and that he did. He later comes back. And in fact, for the War of 1812, where he fights and acquits himself reasonably well. There are some people who will never shop at his store again. There are some people who will, not look at him on the street. But there are some people who remain friends of his. The family compact that was in place remains close to him, and he lives out most of his days in in Toronto before he goes, or in the town of York, before he goes back to Scotland and dies. The one truly invented thing about him is that he didn't have a young protege that he brought with him. And also, while there was a Hellfire Club in Scotland that he could well have visited, he certainly would have known about it. In Anstruther, they're called the Beggar's Benison. There's no indication that he belonged to it, and there's no indication that the Beggar's Benison had a Molly house as part of its construction. That's all made up by me. The Beggar's Benison did exist. There's a lovely book about it that I found extremely useful. It was in fact filled with high-powered men who did in fact have some odd sexually colored rituals. So it wouldn't have been a great surprise to find out that there was homosexual activity there, but it was not something that was documented per se. So that takes care of that. As for the essays, they are entirely true. So yes,
David.
So yes, I have been a horror fan since I was a child. Yeah, there are things I left out. Yes, I have had a horrible relationship with my mother. I might as well just say it. And yes, I have a disability, which, while mostly invisible, is not entirely invisible, and which probably will result in my either using a walker or being in a wheelchair by the time I'm in my late 60s. It's called hypokalemic periodic paralysis. I was not diagnosed. I started having attacks when I was 12, but I was not diagnosed until I was 40. And in fact, when I was diagnosed at 40, a boyfriend at the time had to rush me to emergency because I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't speak, and it was reaching the point where I couldn't breathe. And my heart rate had dropped to 45 and was continuing to drop. And this had happened, I mean, not to this severity, but this had happened on and off throughout my life. And I had thought it was psychosomatic. I thought it was something like lupus or MS. But of course, I kept getting better. It would take 2 or 3 days sometimes, but I kept getting better. And so my doctors, because they had no idea, were like, we don't know. So it wasn't until I was at St. Mike's Emergency, and I'll always remember Dr. Simon Kingsley. He was this guy with like boundless energy, and he came running in, and he was like, we'll find out what it is. We'll figure it out. And I was in a heart bed because there were none anywhere else in the building at the time. And after like half an hour, 40 minutes, he came running back, and he was like, I think I know what it is. Do you do carbo loading? And I'm like, I don't even know what that is. He's like, it's when you consume a lot of carbs, when you're getting ready for like a marathon run. And I was like, do I look like I go on marathon runs? And he looked at me and he was like, right. So he ran back out again. Then he ran back in again. He was like, now I really know what it is. And then he put me on a potassium drip. And over the course of like 24 hours, I was able to like move my extremities again. And it's a genetic condition. It probably carried through my father's line, the Ukrainian line, because it's a 1 in 100,000 person condition, and it affects mostly Asian people. Mm-hmm. And of course, Ukraine has quite a lot of influx from people from Asia, from a variety of things in history, and this may well be a legacy of that. And so if I commit the cardinal sin of eating, I have to wolf down some potassium in order I can take enough potassium to like execute a man in Texas. And it doesn't do anything to me. Yeah, I know. And so, don't try to knock me off that way. But
take note, everyone.
Yes, exactly. But that's basically what it is. At a certain point, it is absolutely true. Fact and fiction in the book and my presence in the book all sort of collide in a way where you can't quite tell what's real or what's not. Those parts that are about my mother having cancer and my having to go to the mall with her, those are absolutely true. Those are absolutely true. So, and there's me on my phone, like texting friends of mine, and they're texting me, and me pretending that it's work, you know. So, so that stuff was all absolutely real. And of course, you know, as I've alluded, where I touch on Bruce MacArthur, my experiences around all of that are true as well. I will. Truly not to ruin anything, but I will say that there are things that happen with my character in the book that suggest that I go out at night, you know, in the middle of the night, go looking for men, go looking for trouble. That much is completely not true. I'm someone who orders in. I'm not someone who goes out. I am terrified of everything, and you know, and that would be one of those things that I'm terrified of. So you can actually tell at that point, okay, we sort of crossed the bridge into not quite complete reality. But a lot of what's in there is like totally me. There's
well,
stuff,
you know,
there's stuff in the fiction sections that are not even attributed to me that are totally me. There's a scene with a character being awoken by a cat with a mouse that actually happened to me. Yes, that is the right facial expression. I will not tell any of you what that is. You will get to it yourself, but that was absolutely 100% true. So there's a lot of me in this book. I haven't by any means exhausted all there is that I have to say, but I would say the greatest hits are all in there one way or another.
good to know. And I mean, you know, you telling us that you're like an order in, staying inside person is exactly what a secret night roamer would want us to believe.
Oh,
so
yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
fact or fiction, who knows, really, David Demchuk. I'm going to encourage the audience to remember to write your own questions for David into the Q&A, as we'll be turning to that portion of the night soon enough. Anthony, if you have questions about the perfect murder weapon, then you know this might be the time, right? Like, you know, so we'll come back to that. But you know, before we do get to it, David, oh, Jake, arsenic and old lace, right? Well, you know, before we do get to that, I wanted to ask, you know, about horror. It seems, you know, the appropriate question, because, you know, you've been in the genre for such a long time. Your first novel, The Bone Mother, is, I believe, the first horror, possibly the first genre novel to make the Giller list.
Not the first genre novel, because they have had things that I would describe as fantasy and science fiction, but it was certainly the first horror novel. And that was amazing. It was something we would never have expected.
Truly. Well, and I mean, when one hears that in Canadian theater or in Canadian literary arts there isn't a place for horror, I mean, I think you are changing that. So that's huge. And in the book, you give us a bit of like meta commentary on horror. Actually, there's an essay where you kind of give us like a tiny brief history of horror and its relationship to queers. You talk about how, you know, initially the horror genre was about the monster from outside the family, right? And how there's these monsters that then the pure heroes within the family then sacrifice themselves to destroy to keep the family safe. And then suddenly there is this shift to locating horror within the family. Rosemary's Baby, Stephen King, that sort of thing. And you talk about queers like identifying with horror, whether as the creature outside or the creature within, right? And something I'm thinking about, which the novel makes me sort of really, really wonder and whimper about, is, well, we as a queer community, whatever that is, often look within ourselves for an extra monster, right? And that's sort of what this book is in some ways about, that we queers are the monsters, and then there's monsters within the monstrous hunting us. And anyway, I just wanted to ask you, like, what is horror to you, and why do you work in this genre?
Well, I mean, I find, so much of why I work in the genre comes from why I love the genre, and that dates back to my childhood. Whether it's, you know, my mother, there were many issues I had with my mother, but one of the things that I will always be terribly grateful to her for is that she read to us when we were kids. And she didn't just read us fairy tales because they bored her. She read a lot of classic adult fiction from her own childhood that she had. We were read Jane Eyre.
Horror on its own.
Horror on its own. We were read Tom Sawyer, which I mean is horrible, racist as fuck. However, there were parts of it that were completely terrifying. There were a lot of things that we were read as kids that that I think in part went over our heads, but we really developed a love of the spoken word and experiencing literature that way. And I really, I loved, horrible Disney villains. At that point, it was the old school, largely, misogynistic portrayals of women Disney villains. But to me, I was like, these are fabulous. And,
we love them. We love those women.
We love those women, absolutely. You wanted to be them, you wanted to be with them. So, so yeah, absolutely. And then we saw, a lot of stuff. You never really were able to see the movies that were happening, like The Exorcist and stuff like that. But what they would do is they'd make watered down versions of them as TV movies. And we used to watch those things all the time. Like you couldn't see the real Carrie, but you could see the watered down TV version of it. Oh, she can control snakes with her mind, things like that. And as a kid, I ate that stuff up. I ate up the Night Gallery. I ate up, the Twilight Zone. There was, chiller, thriller, horror movies. And as you know, I'm an extremely anxious person. I'm frightened of everything. And yet there was something thrilling about being frightened and yet being in control. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that was thrilling throughout that period was a lot of more obviously queer actors and a lot of more obviously queer writers and a lot of more obviously queer scenarios were starting to manifest themselves really in popular media overall, but particularly in popular media that was set in and around the supernatural. Mm-hmm. And I just was fascinated by this because I was starting to see myself or the way that I imagined myself to be, or I could look at somebody and I could say, is this me? And that was very important to me. When we got to that point where horror started to subvert the family rather than to enshrine the family, I saw myself in a lot of that as well. And that's where I really, thought to myself, this is something more than just scary fun. This is something that is commenting on the way the world works, the way that families work. I actually did a class visit a few months ago, and one of the instructors asked me, why do you think it is that fairy tales so often place the danger in the family, with evil stepmothers and things like that, rather than on the outside? And I said, because it's true.
Because that's where evil lives. And not just the stepmother, but the real mother.
Yeah, exactly. It is so rare that you are attacked or abused by a stranger. And it is so common that it happens in the household by a friend or a family member, whether a parent or a sibling. And fairy tales were subtly and not so subtly telling you, watch what's going on in your own home. That's the first place that things are going to happen. And of course, in Eastern European fairy tales, when the children are cast out into the woods, Baba Yaga is not necessarily a villain. She's not necessarily a hero, but she is not necessarily a villain. She's going to test you. And sometimes she'll test you in goofy ways. And that was a really interesting lesson as well, that not every witch that you encounter is necessarily going to be evil or going to be ugly or going to eat you. Sometimes something else will happen instead. So that stuff meant a great deal to me. And I've always found a lot of comfort in horror, because it is a controlled experience the way that a roller coaster is a controlled experience. Mm-hmm. It's not that roller coasters aren't dangerous, but the danger is rare. If I'm reading a horror novel, if I'm watching something on television, even if I'm watching something at the movies, I have a great deal of control over the experience, even as I'm surrendering myself to it. I went to see an early screening of Hereditary, and the theater was nearly empty. And there was this one woman at, of course, a pivotal scene who was so outraged that she stomped down, stomped across, and stomped out the door. And then about 10 minutes later, she stomped back in. I guess she couldn't get her money back. And stomped back to her seat. And then at another pivotal moment. Stomp, 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 stomp. So, but she had, I didn't appreciate it, but she had agency. She knew what she could handle, and she just was like, enough's enough. And we don't get to have that level of agency in real life sometimes. And horror can prepare us for moments when we have that agency, even if it's to tell us, don't go up the stairs, go out the door. Everyone upstairs is dead. You have to leave. Like, just do it.
And yet we go upstairs anyway.
Oh, and yet we go upstairs. Oh yeah, all the time, because we have to see. And that's the thing that's interesting about horror. We have to see. We have to see with our own eyes what the situation is. We can't just go, no, I'm booking it. I'm out of here. The best characters in horror movies for me are the ones who, like, 20 minutes in are like, you know what? No. And you never see them again. They're just gone. Like, you are the winners.
Yeah, those are the characters that I don't identify with, but greatly admire. Yes. And I mean, you're saying so many important things here. One of which that stands out is that much of the horrifying, like violence, dwells in the intimate.
Yes.
Like in the private space, the close space, intimate space is where license and range for violence happens. And I mean, this naturally brings me to sex, of course. There is so much that is sexy about this novel. At least I think so.
Well, thank you.
And I guess I'm curious, like, I think there's a tradition even of queer horror and queer sexiness coming together. I remember when I was a 12-year-old, I read an article about this in Extra West, when Extra West was still a thing. I was secretly reading my copy of Extra West that was like, horror and queers, they go together, and me being like, those are my people. I think I'm going to go there. And I wonder if you feel that same connection between intimacy and horror, sexiness and the scary, and what that's like for you.
For sure. I mean, one of the themes that emerges in Red X is that marginalized people, and particularly marginalized people within a community that's already marginalized, feel a tremendous amount of loneliness, and they feel a tremendous amount of isolation. And that makes them vulnerable. That makes them vulnerable to predators, because you want to trust people. And that is, and you should be able to trust people. We should be able to trust each other. We should be able to come together as a community. But so often things are fractured and people are left, sort of like out on the outside edge and isolated even from each other. And it is natural and human for people to want to trust, to want to be intimate with each other. And we see this over and over again in queer stories where people are judged. One of the reasons why the disappeared men, the situations aren't being investigated is because, it must have happened during a gay hookup, So therefore there's this feeling of, oh, well, you shouldn't hook up. Anyone who hooks up is asking to be violated in some way, is asking to have things happen to them. We see this with women as well. We see this in particular, racial communities. You see this narrative over and over again. Well, you put yourself in danger. You should expect when you put yourself in danger that things will happen. And it's like, no, not at all. That is absolutely not the case. The thing that is very moving there are so many things for me that are moving in the book. But one of the things that's moving for me in the book is the fact that these are people who are reaching out, who want to be, who want to have intimacy, even when they don't want to be known, even when they want to conceal themselves, even when they want to preserve that isolation, they still crave the intimacy. And then when things happen to them, it's heartbreaking, because they should be able to have that. They should be able to have someone in their lives who can truly know them on a physical and intimate level. And we are continually judged and challenged and denied that. And you see it in the book over decades. And that, I think, is a critical part of what makes it work. And for me, it was very important for me not to sit down and write sex scenes, because I find sex scenes actually really challenging to write, but to use the sex scenes that are in there to reveal character, and to reveal character through intimacy, through humor, through everything but the mechanics. First, because I don't write the mechanics terribly well, but also because to me it's not the mechanics that matter as much as how people are opening themselves to each other, revealing themselves to each other, being vulnerable with each other in these situations. Even the monster is isolated. Even the monster is lonely. The monster is enacting his anger over his loneliness, over his betrayal, over his isolation through these men who, when he consumes them, continue to linger as shades in and around where he lives, and they yearn to be free of him. It's complicated, and it's painful. It's painful for him. It's painful for them, and it's painful for all the people who are left behind.
Wow. I'm going to be thinking about this for a long time. Thank you, David. I have so many more questions for you, but they're going to have to wait because apparently we have limited time in this life, but also in this life. So I will ask you a question from the audience, and then I think we'll have to wrap up. So this is from Adam Pottle. Hello, Adam.
Oh, hello, Adam.
So Adam asks, hi, David. I have a question about Canadian horror. Where do you see the genre going in the future?
I think, I mean, part of the issue with horror in general in North America, and I think is especially true in Canada, is that we have an image of horror through other media, film first, television first, and then it occurs to people, oh, there are books and stories that are horror stories, and they're not written by Stephen King. I must investigate this. I mean, that is kind of, I think, how it dawns on people that horror in Canadian fiction exists. So part of it is the audience has to make the discovery. Most horror in Canada is done through small presses, who themselves are challenged financially, challenged as far as resources go, the ability to promote things and so on. So it becomes kind of a niche market, but it's still present. I think that as we are currently in a really interesting horror renaissance, and particularly a horror renaissance that where the creators are investigating political themes, investigating racial themes, investigating women's issues, queer and trans issues. That I think is going to lead the way for the next wave. And I think that Canadians, as much as anyone, are in a position to take advantage of that. Certainly I'm trying, with Red X. It's a book I don't think that could have succeeded 20 years ago. I don't think it could necessarily have been published 20 years ago. And yet there is so much to talk about in the way we live now that that benefits from using horror as the lens. And that, I think, is what the future is. I mean, anyone who is interested in writing horror, I encourage you, by all means, check out the many magazines online and offline that accept submissions. Check out the publishers who are accepting manuscripts. Find some agents, talk with other writers online and in person. There are ways of doing that. I really miss having things like Word on the Street in person. I really miss having the conferences and the festivals that I used to go to, where you could interact with other people in a much more, sort of meaningful way. I love doing stuff virtually. In fact, in many ways, I love doing stuff virtually more because the anxiety is much lower.
You get to stay in and do it.
And I get to do lighting. And if only I could carry it with me everywhere. But at the same time, a lot of those casual connections are difficult to make now. And but it can be done. It absolutely can be done. And if you have an interest in horror, I encourage you to pursue it. There's never been more of a there have never been more markets for horror. They're all small, but there have never been more of them. And each and every one is worth taking a look at and checking out.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, David. I have one last rapid fire surprise question for you because I know you've been anticipating my grilling for a day. Are you ready?
No. Yes.
My question for you is, what is a monster?
What is a monster? A monster is something that we have led ourselves to believe is not us.
Hmm.
The monster always seems to be somewhere else rather than within us. Of course, we know, particularly we who are creators know, we carry monsters with us all the time. And it is in our best interest, whether you work in horror or not, to turn and take a long, hard look at the monster within you, and to a certain extent, learn to love and accept the monster in yourself. It's really only through that process, which is a process that I absolutely went through when writing this book. It's really the only way, I think, that you can reconcile a lot of the conflicts and contradictions within yourself, is to come to love and accept the monster within yourself.
Mic drop. We're really ready for that. Thank you so much, David. Congratulations again. Everybody should go buy a copy of Red X immediately, preferably from McNally Robinson, but if not, from the local independent bookstore of your choice.
It comes pre-distressed, like its author.
I think John is going to hop on to give us a wrap up. Yes, there you are, John.
Yes, indeed. And thank you so much, Kai Cheng. And thank you, David, for such an incredibly engaging conversation. Everybody out there who's read David before know what an incredibly multifaceted and thrilling author he is. So I'm here to host this event, but I'm also here as an effusive fan who loved The Bone Mother and just absolutely adored Red X. So please do get yourself a copy of this book as soon as you can. You will not be disappointed. And again, just in the spirit of pure capitalism, please do feel free to get in touch with McNally Robinson Booksellers. You can give us a call. You can visit us in person. You can order the book online. One way or another, we'll make sure that a copy of this book makes its way to you. I would also point out that Kai Cheng Thom's wonderful books, just a few of which are in front of me, may also be purchased. So please do avail yourself of those. You will not be disappointed. I'd also like to close by thanking, of course, Strange Light, an imprint of Penguin Random House Canada, who published this book and are taking a chance on lots of interesting literature as well. So please do check out that imprint. And thank you again to them for publishing this book. And thank you to all of you for joining us here tonight. It was such a pleasure to spend the evening with you, particularly in such august company. So thank you all. Have a lovely evening.